That's all right. So, okay, opening question. With the opening question for you, we'll go into pairs, groups of two, is what brings you to this conversation? It may be people that you know, and it may be the group, but in particular, what is it about this topic that you find important or intriguing? So 10 minutes with a partner. And when you get back, I'll invite you to share in chat and then have a few of you speak out loud. So again, what makes this topic important or intriguing to you in pairs? So welcome back, everybody. I hope your warm-up discussion was fruitful, and it would help me to know what brings you here. So I would love for those of you who are willing just to type a sentence or two into the chat, nothing too long, so we all can read what brings you here, what makes this important to you. Do that now. And I would also love if those of you who are not muted to mute, because we can't hear background sounds. I'll read a few of these. Alistair says action steps. We have Sarah Ann, a desire to enlarge my vocabulary and thought process. Vocabulary for me has been a big part of the learning. Mike took my stepping up class with Greg and Jewel Thomas, who are two close colleagues of mine who are not here, yet big influences on. Intrigued by the anti-race, anti-racists. Understanding privilege through the eyes of race. Steph, I'm not going to read all of these, but what these terms really mean. Great, we'll get into that. Competing narratives. It's part of creating an inclusive work environment. That's very interesting. Yeah, American democracy. Fumbling around is a great term. I use the term wrestling, but I'm also fumbling while I wrestle. That's a helpful term. More on what they mean. Nuanced, but without nuance. Great. What it would look like. Okay, anti-race and deepen my wonderful. Okay. Yeah, thank you. And I wanted to just see if maybe one or two of you, let's just say one person, felt the urge just to share what brings you here, to bring your voices into the room, because I'm going to send you back out to another breakout group in just a moment. Anybody want to speak out loud? Raise your hand or jump in. How do you say your name? Is it Lila?
Leela.
Leela. Thank you, Leela.
Hi. I just wanted to share that what brings me here is curiosity, one thing. And I've read your ebook, and I think what I got really curious about, I think it felt like it was about the words, the languaging, and how if we could just speak slightly differently, it would help us stop our being racist, if I can call it that. However, after the conversation with my partner just now, I'm just like, the question was, so what is that thing that's behind the language? So for me, it's like, what is the awareness that we need to bring in that kind of makes us aware that we're about to be, we are not anti-racist. So yeah, I don't know if all that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's a very important point. There's the language that we speak, and then there are all the interior assumptions, narratives, thoughts. You might say how we listen. Microhabits that are valuable for each of those. I do emphasize language a lot because one of the traditions I come out of is a branch of linguistics that posits you are what you say. In other words don't just describe reality, they bring them into being. And far too often in conversations like this, that's left out. But that's only part of the story. That's only part of the story. So thank you. So Julia reminded me in advance of her, you all really like to talk and be in discussion. So I want to move on to the next group discussion. And let me pull up one slide. Okay. So here is a question for you. It says individual reflection, and then you'll chat with a partner. And I would love, maybe easiest, Julie, just to do the same partners again, since they had such a short chat. So when you hear the following, what do you think of? Let's talk about race. So when someone says, let's talk about race, or we need to talk more about race, what does that mean to you? Another way of saying that is, what does the word race bring to mind for you? Okay, so that's one question. And then the second is, if you hear someone like me say it's time to deracialize, what does that mean to you? What do those words bring up in your mind? And you might even notice what physical sensations and what emotions that brings up as well. So let's go back into the rooms for, let's say another 10 minutes, and then we'll come back. We're going to sort of iterate here. Okay. So let me stop share. So Julia, you have my green light to
Done.
open up the rooms. Good.
Hi, I'm just going to do a quick.
Okay. Yeah, welcome back. So again, since we have a good sized group, I would love to have you just put, a sentence or so on for the first question. Let's talk about race. What does that bring up for you? What does that make you think of? Put that in the chat, please. Yeah, so we have some comments about booby trap, constricting. Let's talk about race is different from we need to talk about race. Excitement and curiosity. It depends. Other context dependent. Depends on who's inviting the conversation. Yeah. So I'm seeing a real mix of kind of a booby trap, tightness, constricting, and on the other hand, it really depends on the context, who's starting it. That really resonates for me. Yeah. Okay. Okay, there's a couple more. Visceral, yeah. Yeah, I shouldn't be surprised that in this mature group, it depends would be a natural response. Right. So the question itself is a little bit of a booby trap. Let's do the second one. Just have you type in briefly the question around deracializing. What is that? What did you discover that brings up for you? What's the motive? I think that's a great question that we're going to get into. That's a really important one. A couple folks talk about, being more expanding and action-oriented, some curiosity and complexification. Here's a comment, the idea that it isn't possible to deracialize, which it's certainly been part of my experience. Can we even do this? Intriguing. Where do you begin? This is the wrong term, and I don't know a better term. Yeah, is this going to be a free ticket out of the hard work? Yeah, great. Okay, thank you. Seeing far, so there's a lot of different interpretations of this, and what I'd like to do is share some of where I'm coming from and use that to stimulate the next round of conversation from all of you. Some of you who've read my writings in depth or been in course together, I think have a good sense, but most of you probably don't know what I mean by race and deracializing. So I'm gonna, it might be 10, 15 minutes. Maybe I'll stop before then, but share some of my thoughts, okay? And all right. And Simon and Julia, can you shake your head up if you can see that? Okay, good. So one of the main things that I would love to have everybody come away with, at least to grapple with, you may not accept this, and that's fine, but at least to grapple and wrestle with, is the idea that when one person says race, other people can hear many different things. And one of the reasons that a lot of folks feel understandably concerned, to put it mildly, when someone says deracialize, is that they think it means let's stop talking about racism, which is very understandable. There are actually people out there who, when they say we need to deracialize, are basically saying history's past. Everybody's, there could be the colorblind school of thinking, I just see everybody the same. It could be, this is about class, or it could be, these problems don't exist anymore. Well, I basically think that's a bunch of bullshit, right? To me, when I talk about deracializing, I am not talking about that. So I just want to really emphasize this. And I only know the United States context particularly well, but there's an enormous amount of data. I'll just give you, just so you know where I'm coming from. We know this phenomenon of driving while Black, of folks with darker skin being more likely to get pulled over, more likely to get arrested. And something I just learned recently now, in many states, when you get arrested, you actually get a genetic test done, and that gets profiled. And then when all that gets in the record, if in the future, suddenly you're suspect, and it could have been just because you were pulled over for no reason or for speeding. We have this whole thing in the United States around incarceration, where in the 90s, Congress passed some legislation that made possession of drugs, not even dealing drugs, this crime with minimal sentencing guidelines. Crack, which tended to be used more by Black Americans, not cocaine, which was the drug of choice for white identified Americans. So we have millions and millions of people in prison because of that, for basically nothing. And so there's that whole phenomenon. We absolutely have to talk about that. And I'm actually really grateful that the last few years that conversation has picked up. We also have a conversation around just police relationships with people. And this conversation has changed and become such a part of the public. So just to give you an example, back in 1991, 92, there was a man named Rodney King who was beat by police in Los Angeles, and somebody recorded it, as many of you may recall, and it became a court case, and the officers that beat him were let off. So I was in college at that time, and I went to a candlelight vigil where one of the people there took a baseball bat that was used and hit the ground one time for every time that he was beaten. I remember that, and I also remember how few people were at that vigil. It was 30 years ago, 15, maybe 18 people. And I remember actually being scared to be there because it felt like I was being against the police, and that was wrong or unpatriotic. So the bad news is that that violence continues. The good news is that a lot more folks are finally talking about it, putting their bodies in the way and speaking about it. So I went in length about that because, we could do this for any topic, including health disparities. We need to talk more about that. And that's a different session. That's a related session, but that's a different session than this one, right? What I would like to focus on here is how racialized identity contributes to everything I've just said. Not race, but racialized identity. So what do I mean by that? Racialized identity is when I see someone with skin that's darker or similar to mine, and I think Black, white, Asian. And all of a sudden, these connotations come into me, just like that. I can't speak for all of you in other countries, but in the United States, this is practically a national creed. So I'll get into in a moment. So the form of race that I want to deracialize is where we immediately assume by looking at someone that they have some character, intelligence, personality, athletic skill or lack thereof, ability to dance because of how they look. To me, that's what I'm focused on. And I want to talk about that and how that contributes to all of the expressions of racism and discrimination. I want to show how they're connected. Okay. Again, this is nuanced and this is complex, but that's the connection I want to make. When we say race, it also can mean culture. In the United States, a lot of Black Americans, when they say Black, they're actually referring to a culture that they're proud of, a culture that they grew up in. It's a way of honoring parents and grandparents. Let's preserve that. And I said earlier about geographic ancestry. Sometimes when people say race, they actually mean where their ancestors came from. Well, ancestry is genetic, but it's not racial. Because, as I'll say in a minute, there are no 5 or 6 races. This is not there. So my proposition for us to consider is let's understand how we racialize ourselves in identity while we combat many of the historic and current problems that exist. All right. Okay, let me just give you a sense of why this really makes me sick in the stomach. Race. Okay, what I mean by race. So in the 18th century and beyond, science started to classify people. This is a very, very prominent German scientist in his time, Blumenbach, who was in the mode of classifying people through their skulls. And he's the one who actually coined the term Caucasian. And in this diagram, Caucasian is the middle skull. And he got all these skulls together and did measurements and decided which skull is the most beautiful. So for him, it was all about beauty. And so you see, we've got Mongolian, American, which means Native American or First People. We've got Malay and we've got Ethiopian. So for him, the closer to the center you are, the more beautiful. The further from the center, the less beautiful. And this was commonly understood. This is what race was about. It was about beauty, all right? Now, why Caucasian? That's a long story that Nell Irving Painter talks about in her book, The History of White People. But it's basically people living in Georgia and Chechnya, basically countries that Russia has invaded in recent years. And this was this idea that the most beautiful women in the world were Georgian women. And this is a skull from an unnamed Georgian woman. So this is what we're talking about when we're talking about race. This is where this comes from. So fast forward 40 or 50 years, we have an American, very prominent scientist, Samuel Morton, Philadelphia, who realized, okay, this isn't about beauty, it's about intelligence. And he went ahead and measured skull sizes, not the dimensions, but the size of the skull. And his theory was that the larger the skull you had, the smarter you were. Now we know this is crap. This doesn't make any sense scientifically, but this was the theory. And you can actually still go to a museum in Philadelphia at Penn, University of Pennsylvania. So again, notice 5 categories. There were 4, there's 5 here. Nobody can really agree on how many races there are. But the idea is that there's this distinct set that's biologically, genetically wired. When you're born into it, you stay into it for your life, and you can tell from the outside what's going on in the inside. So this Samuel Morton's work, the Southerners in the United States who were continuing to look for justifications for slavery picked up on this and used this to justify slavery, which is another thing I just want to add in here, that oftentimes here in the United States, we think that people were racist and that's why we have slavery. And that's not how it happened. First of all, there's a lot more slavery that happened before the United States, and there have been people of all colors of skin that have been enslaved. Hopefully we all remember that. Americans tend to forget that. We think it's a Black thing. There were decades of slavery in the United States before the Commonwealth of Virginia created a law that invented whiteness, basically, in the 17th century. That's when race began here legally. And the purpose of it was you have a country that claims to be, at least, you know, by the time of the Declaration of Independence, of all men are created equal. How do you reconcile that with enslaving people? Well, you basically say we're a different race. One race is less human than the other. So those rules don't apply. That's how it started. So when I think of race, I think of these skulls and I think of that rationalization for slavery. And those of you who are in different countries probably have your own examples. So where does racism come from? I'm not talking about systemic racism. That's another talk. I'm talking about the belief that some races are innately superior. To have that view, you have to also believe that there are distinct biological races. Otherwise, what are you going to be comparing? And that physical traits represent inner essence. And, you know, here in the United States, here's kind of where we take our stand. Biological races exist. Well, a lot of people know that isn't true, but yeah, I'll kind of put up with that. Particularly if I'm combating racism. Yeah, I'll just kind of agree with that. Physical traits equal inner essence. I'm not going to really speak up about that. Yeah, that's okay. Seems like people are a little different. Some races are innately superior. Well, unless you're a white supremacist or a deeply racist, a lot of folks are saying hell no. And we're saying hell no to this, but we're kind of not saying much about the other ones. And that's where I'm wondering whether if we want to combat racism, maybe we ought to start with the notion that there are distinct races rather than the argument that some are better than others. And what if just documenting racism isn't getting us very far? What if we actually attacked it at its roots? So very briefly, it's been over 70 years since scientists, anthropologists said there's no basis in science for racial bias. It's less a biological fact than a social myth. Geneticists followed suit 50 years ago. There was a ceremony where President Bill Clinton in 2000 brought together the results of the Human Genome Project and said, we now know that all human beings are 99.99% genetically similar. 99.9% genetically similar. And all the world's genetic diversity is contained in the continent of Africa today. So if you're, and I know we have some South Africans and others there, but if you have someone maybe from one country in South Africa, compare them to someone else a few countries away or even in the same country, you're as likely to be genetically similar to someone in a European country as that person in another part of Africa. That's what the geneticists say. So how can you know that and still believe in biological race? So here's something that I do. This is a little geeky, but this is a practical thing. We have 46 chromosomes, 23 pairs. There's 150 that code for skin color. And this one in particular, who cares about the name of it? It's on chromosome 15. But what I do is I look at, okay, there are all these chromosomes. Then we have this one, and it's all these little strands. And then there's this tiny little portion that codes for skin color. I visualize that. And when I visualize, I realize we're making a whole big bunch of assumptions based upon this tiny little set of genes, right? 1/5000th of the chromosome. And those genes don't code for anything else. They have nothing to do with intelligence, character, personality, courage, willingness to work, all the stuff that so-called nominally Black people have been accused of being less of and white having more of. It's bullshit. There's another one. So we think it's real here in the United States. We've got white power advocates. We've got the Nation of Islam. Malcolm X was the most well-known leader. We now have Louis Farrakhan still in charge, who believe that there was originally a Black race, and then an evil Black scientist named Yorub created a white race, which is the devil race. Not so helpful. We have two prominent anti-racists. If you asked Robin DiAngelo or Ibram X. Kendi, do you believe there's such a thing as biological race? They would say, of course not. In fact, I've read their books. They say it in their books, but then they both say, but race is a social construction, Robin DiAngelo, therefore, Ibram X. Kendi, if we try and deracialize, we're basically ignoring racism, which is something a lot of you may be thinking. And this is a confusion, in my view, between racialized identity and everything else we're talking about, biological race. Here's a race drug that came out 15 years ago. So geneticists are getting into the act, despite all we know. This was a drug that the Food and Drug Administration in the United States rejected originally. And then a company came in and said, we want to market this just for African Americans. Anybody can get it. We're going to market it for them. It's a heart disease drug. And they got approved. Now, it didn't go so well. And one reason it didn't go so well is because of the history of the United States. So a lot of racialized Black Americans saw that there was a drug just for them and said, screw this. And there was one, I saw a quote from an older grandmother, Black American grandmother, who said, don't give me that. Give me the drugs that the white people have, which is kind of funny, but it also represents a harsh truth of medicine and science in the United States. We have charts like this, which are very common, which break out data by race, so-called race. And then we have the Census Bureau, which asks, what is this person's race? So it's all there codified. And it's one reason why when we grow up, when we're kids, it's how people look, but it's also in the air. We all learn, again, just the United States I'm speaking of, that there are these distinct races and that it means something. So there's a difference between seeing race, which I don't think is helpful. She is Black or she is white. That's essentializing. That's claiming that there's something about that person that I can tell. A equals B. What I've been practicing, and my friend Greg Thomas, who's a Black American, has encouraged me to do, is to see racialized identity. People see her as Black. Left side, this is claiming to know the person and describe them. Frankly, that's racist. The right side is an active interpretation. What I'm basically saying is, I'm unwilling to racialize you or this person, but I see that everyone else does, or most people do, and we got to name that. And we got to name that because that affects this person's life. You see the distinction? It's complex, but there it is. We also don't need biological race to track discrimination. There's a wonderful book called The Arc of a Bad Idea, Understanding and Transcending Race by Carlos Hoyt Jr. And he imagines what would the US Census look like if we deracialized people in a way that we could still track discrimination and wealth inequality and different treatment in the criminal justice system. So I don't know if you all can read this, but here are some questions. Do you self-identify as a member of a race or ethnicity? Yes or no? You actually get to choose. Imagine that. If you do identify, which group do you affiliate with? Not which one are you, which do you affiliate with? And then the third question, I just love that he did this because I think it solves a lot of problems. Whether or not you identify as a member of a racial or ethnic group, how do most others identify you in terms of race and ethnicity? How do most others identify you? So just imagine, what if we gathered this data rather than people's races? And I don't know exactly how it would work, but when we were tracking data, it would be based on their racialized identity rather than their race. It might take a while to re-socialize, but at least our official documents wouldn't be supporting what is a falsehood, a dangerous falsehood. So we can still honor culture. We've got some famous icons from Black American history. We've got Duke Ellington here, Mary Anderson, the opera singer, Prince, one of his first few albums. And then we have the proprietor of a soul food restaurant, I believe in New Orleans. As long as we believe in race, I believe it's hard to see distinct cultures. And I was just accused of trying to erase culture. The person hadn't read anything I'd written. And as soon as I responded, she deleted her comment. But a lot of white Americans don't see the richness of Black American culture. They don't see how much they've gained from it because they're blinded by race. And we can trace our ancestral origins. So Isaiah Washington is an American actor who 15 years ago went to a company called African Ancestry and said, I want to know where my ancestors came from. And they said, they come from the Mende tribe in Sierra Leone. And as you can see, and those of you who live in the African continent know this country a lot better than us Americans. It's just a little red dot here, okay? And even within that country, the Mende, if I'm pronouncing that right, tribe is just part of the country. Notice how specific that is. Is that a race? No, we don't need to accept biological race to finally, I'm tearing up, finally give Black Americans the opportunity to learn where at least some of their ancestors came from. And I say some because you can only trace your father's 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 father or your mother's 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 mother. It's the only way you can do it, mitochondrial DNA or Y chromosome for the men. So, but at least for him, he was able to go, okay, I've got, I believe it was on the mother's side all the way back, and he was able to go there and feel a sense of connection. I think he actually got citizenship there. And having said that, we still have genetic tests that reinforce this. They don't give you that level of detail. They say your ancestry is 63% sub-Saharan Africa, and they give you 4 other categories, which coincidentally enough matches the races, so-called races. So to me, deracializing is a way of seeing people's humanity. It's about a way of loving each other more. There's Earth, Wind, and Fire saying you can't hide love, but you can keep yourself from loving by racializing people. And finally, this is an adult development crowd. This can help. I think everybody here has a commitment to combating racism. Some of us want to deracialize people, and we have another commitment. We have a commitment to loyalty to parents, to fitting in. If we have light skin like me, we don't want to give talks like this because we're going to be accused of not being against racism, right? So it's very hard to talk about. So we all have these competing, we have one foot in the gas, one foot on the brakes, and the brakes are supported by, in the United States, every dimension of society. And it's one reason why I've been calling biological race the last refuge of the socialized mind. Even many folks who identify post-conventionally, we still believe this. Barbara and Karen Fields, author of Racecraft, 2 Black American Women, say that this is basically like witchcraft. It's like believing in witches, believing in race. So it's understandable that we would all have this superstitious belief. So let me stop the share there and take a breath. All right, so I'd like to move us into discussion groups, but before we do that, I wanted to just see if any of you have any clarifying questions about what I'm suggesting, and I promise to answer in brief so that we can then go into small groups. But if it's just a clarifying question that you have, or if you want to stir the pot and raise an objection, feel free. I'm just not going to engage in too much depth because I want to get into small groups. Comment? Something surprising or new? I'm really kind of curious. The little survey here, if you could just put into the chat, and then we're going to go into breakout rooms. I'm curious whether you feel tighter or more relaxed after this. My experience is that people tighten, and then once they really get a chance to experience this, they feel unburdened. And if you're committed to combating racism, particularly if you identify as white, I think being unburdened is a friggin' good thing, because that means you're actually going to take action around everything we've talked about. So I actually don't think, there's some people who would say, oh, are you just trying to unburden white people? I'd like to unburden white people who want to combat racism so we can get into action. So yeah, I do. So anyways, let's just end here. I'm just curious, just kind of how you're feeling right now, a few words, and then we'll go into small groups. Excited, confused, burdened. Got a couple titers, one titer and energized. Comment about being reclassified as a woman, another complex topic, only of European descent.
Amiel, could
Yeah.
I say something?
Yeah, go ahead.
So for me, it's a very confusing and tricky conversation. So it's what I'm taking out of it, which may or may not be the right thing, is that some of the tools that we were using to combat racism have created racism, is what you're saying.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's really important because there's so much there. I think what you're doing is like, let's focus on one thing here, I think is what you're inviting. And yeah, I mean, just speaking of race and black and white reinforces the very beliefs that undergird racism. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah. And so I suppose my sort of dullness and inability to comment is, what is a more appropriate way to go forward in your mind that isn't caught up in being politically correct?
All right, yeah, let me give you something real quickly.
Yeah.
So from my friend Greg Thomas, I learned new ways of speaking about people. Instead of saying white or black, I'll say so-called white person, or racialized as black, or black identified. It's a very small change. And what it does is it says, I'm not willing to go along with the notion that there's a separate race here. I'm willing to go along with the fact that some people think so, but I'm not willing to go along with that. And if that doesn't seem like a very big change, try it. Right? Try doing that. See how it feels. Try it on 50 or 100 times. Okay. I don't say so-called black because I've stopped saying it, because for a lot of Black Americans, that sounds like a canceling of the culture. But I will say racialized as black, so-called white identity. So part of it is just experimenting with taking a step back, making that an object of awareness rather than being subject to it. So that's one. Okay. A second, something that I found myself doing a few months ago, I was at the grocery store and I sort of turned to the side and there's a woman with more melanin in her skin than me. And I caught myself going, oh, she's black. And then there was like a whole set of connotations, none of which I would call racist per se, but it was like, kind of like, oh, her life must be hard. I wonder what she thinks. Like all these things went through my mind. And then I was like, Amiel, what are you doing? You don't know a damn thing about this person. Right? So you could do that to you could do that to someone who has the same color skin as you. If you have dark skin, you could do it anyway. But it's deracialization. One thing to do is just to catch yourself putting someone in a box. That's the second thing. I mean, the third thing is to notice what it feels like to be able to be curious about someone and what makes them tick, Enneagram type, for example, and not be blocked by race, biological race assumptions. Just see what that feels like to be like, this is a human being who's basically the same as me biologically, a couple of differences, may have been treated differently, may have different degrees of privilege, but fundamentally, we're the same. And I visualize, I'm a geek, I visualize DNA because I'm like, there is such a tiny little thing that separates us. And you know what? That makes me feel good. Okay. Fourth, and I'm going to stop. Here in the US in particular, I think if you're committed to combating racism, one of the things that we could do is not just talk about discrimination and wealth inequality. Let's keep doing that. We could also acknowledge and honor Black American contributions to American culture and the United States. What are we waiting for? Right? And there's all sorts of reasons to do that, but that's a way of combating racism at its source. The idea that there's a group of people that haven't done much. We have to help them. Bullshit. Yeah, the poverty rate is higher, but look at how American history came to be. It was enslaved Black Americans. Frankly, women who raised a lot of white kids and helped them learn to be loved in the South. So there's ways of appreciating. That's why Earth, Wind, and Fire is so important. They have deeply influenced me. That's how Black American culture has influenced who I am. So another thing we can do is just kind of get curious about how is there a culture that is from a skin color different from me that has influenced who I am, and notice what that does for you. Does that answer your question to some degree, Julia? You want to say something more?
Yeah, no, I think it feels incredibly uncomfortable.
Yeah.
But I'm thinking and I'm feeling, and I love the way Krista has expressed that tension. I see Alistair wants to talk, but saying there's the clear immateriality of race on the one hand, and the structural aspect of racism.
Yeah, let's hear from Alistair. Do you have something to say?
Yeah, thanks. So I think I've got a simple solution to this problem. And the solution is to move people up those stages of ego development, because that would take away, first of all, the tension around the conversation around race. And secondly, it would take out the specifics to handling the problem. So for example, as you can see on the screen, I'm Black, but then I'm actually not Black, even according to the South African government, because I'm a foreigner. So my experience is totally different to a Black South African. And also even within those communities of Black people, there are different classes. So if you come up with a solution to say, don't use this or use that word, it might work for me because I'm at a different level of education or privilege, etc., to another Black person. So going back to the original solution, I mean, if you go to the bottom of the spectrum of ego development, someone who's under like self-protecting is probably where racism started in slavery, where people wanted to benefit from racism and slavery financially. And then now I think the next stage is like conforming, and I see it a lot in South Africa where, you know, people be like, let's have one Black person on the board or two people on the Black people on the board so that it's good for the optics. And lately I'm seeing a lot of this, something called the Youth Employment Service, where the company gets like points from the government for employing youths. But then if you look at it, it's not a sustainable solution from the corporate space. It's more like compliance work. Yeah. And I'm seeing it in the US now that they are sort of on this wave of putting Black people in positions of power in corporates. And I think there's a judge now, a Black female judge in the US. But at the end of the day, what are we trying to change? We're trying to change stuff like the Jim Crow laws, right? We want to stop things like driving all Black and it being a risk. So it looks good for the optics, but from an impact and sustainability perspective, it's not going to take us anywhere. That Rodney King story, that's back in the 90s, right? 2000s, we've got George Floyd. So from a progression standpoint, have we really progressed? But we come up with all these fancy words like JEDI, DEI, DEIB, DEI access.
Yeah.
You know what I'm trying to say? That's more like now on a conforming, on a specializing stage where people act like they know stuff and sound woke, but there is actually no action. So I think going back to the original solution is if we move people to higher stages of ego development, right? That way we treat each other as humans, not as Black or Asian American or Latina or an immigrant. Because if you go to specifics, we'll never end the research or the conversation. That's my solution.
Wow, that so much resonates. I do have a question for you. Part of this is one of the reasons why I'm bringing it to this group of post-conventional folks is to explore this deracialization of people question amongst this group. Because even amongst this group, I think it's really hard. And so I just wondered if you had any comments. Yes, let's move people along. Oh my gosh. And even for a crowd like this, I mean, just kind of what your experience is of this notion.
Yeah, I mean, the question would be, what would someone at each stage, how do they deal with difference? Because the thing is, I think the issue with some of those questionnaires is, I mean, everybody says the smart thing, I guess, but if you look at the actions, like, I mean, English is not my first language, but I Googled what compassion means. There's a part of action there. You have to act. So even if you say nice things like, no, I'm okay with gay people, I've got a gay friend or a Black friend or whatever, you know, what are your actions? And the juice is in the actions. And when I look globally, when it comes to JEDI, I think globally we're like not post-con in any way. We're still like trying to comply with what the government says,
Yeah.
or what society deems correct.
Yeah.
So like I said, but I think naturally, if you really move up those stages, you ought to know how to handle difference better if the process is done correctly.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I want to give people a chance to talk into groups, but just to piggyback one more thing on what you were saying, Alistair. So, you know, one thing we can all do is continue our work. This is sort of an affirmation of the work that everyone here does in adult development. It's saying there's another benefit of this, which is it's more likely to help people deracialize. So keep up the work and perhaps bring this dimension into it. There's a second part that I want to add to your solution, at least here in the United States, is if we could change some of the official documents and words on graphs, it could at least affect the way that everybody is socialized, because we all brought into the socialized mind, into diplomat or whatever you want to call it. I would like that what we're brought in, what we socialize into, to be different, right? So let's go. I'd love to do have time for a 1, 2, 4. Maybe we'll just, let's see, it's 26 after the hour. Why don't we just keep this simple and do groups of 3 and give ourselves about 20 minutes, 23 minutes, let's say, come back at 10 minutes of, and what I'd like to just invite you to explore is just what's coming up for you, what you're wrestling with, maybe what's energizing for you, whatever's there for you. I want to leave it open to you to have a chance to explore together what new possibilities may have opened up. Okay, so just to make Julia's job easier, I was going to do a complex thing, but just groups of 3. How's that sound, Julia?
That's fine. There might need to be 2 groups of 4. If that's okay.
Can we do 3, 3, 2 and have a group of 2 instead? I just want to give everybody a chance to speak.
Yeah. Yeah.
4 is a bit bigger. Okay.
Just sorry. I need to add a room. Yeah. Thank you. Sorry about me doing this so slowly, but it is coming. Sorry, people. Thank you for your.
All right, as you come back, would love to have you share in the chat, please. Let your fingers do the talking in the chat. I'm very interested to hear what you found in this conversation with your partners. Yeah, so we have several comments about how would this work in South Africa? Or is it too soon, too fast? It's really important question. There's one group spoke about the distinction between colorblind and this approach, and how do you respond to a sentence stem? So I'll say a couple of things about that. We have a comment from Kate about stages, about what you see at different stages. Micro words. We want more enlightened and fewer that are profoundly racist, although they exist. I would add, none of us are perfect, so these things just come out habitually. Lots of tensions. Yeah, and a couple of people like, let's not move to deracialize in South Africa before we are ready. An alternative to white fragility for those of us who are interested in inclusion. Yeah, another comment about in South Africa, we've got to acknowledge inequality, how ingrained it is, how historic it is before we take away the racial categories. I want to offer a comment on that. Stage perspectives. Why is this topic important? Yeah, unblock uber woke spaces. Okay. I would think maybe we can unblock in semi-woke spaces. Uber woke, I don't spend a lot of time trying to interact with Nicole, but I know what you're saying. I know what you're saying there. Okay, great. Julia, could you make that comment you made, or maybe it was Simon, about the carpet?
Oh, yeah, I think that was
Just
me.
real briefly.
So, you know, in South Africa, okay, I made two comments. The one is that, like, so groups of people were racialized, and then things were taken away from them. And now we want to deracialize before people get their just equality.
Yeah.
So this is like the trickiness in the South African context, is we're not ready to deracialize. But it's that same thing that Krista talks about, where there's real structural inequality, even though race doesn't exist as a concept. And then it's almost like the carpet's being pulled out from underneath us, because the way we were talking about race was using these racial constructs.
Yeah, thank you.
And I think that that's incredibly useful as part of a conversation possibly going somewhere.
Great.
It's just, it knocks us on the head. We're not used to this conversation.
Yeah. Same in the US. And I just like the metaphor of the rug being pulled out from under you. That's certainly how I felt when I heard this in college, which is one reason why I stopped. Basically, I took this class where we learned that race was falsehood and meaningless. And I was very intrigued by it and challenged by it. And then the Rodney King verdict came out. And then I said to myself, race matters, which was an error on my part, because I didn't have to think that there were separate races to see that other people saw that. You get what I'm saying? And I think this is the challenge. I don't know South Africa at all, but I have, just hearing some of you talk, I have the sense that you actually are up for the challenge yourselves of deracializing people. And what I mean is, if right now you see somebody and you think, I know something about them on the inside based on how they look on the outside, I think you're up for the challenge of being like, wait a second, what if I'm wrong? What do I actually know? Now, I don't know the South African context, but I have a sense of this group. I think you could do that and still talk about the history and the current inequalities. I really do. It would take some slight shifts in how you think and talk, but you can do it. And I think the same thing is here in the US. We've got to keep tracking things. We've got to keep tracking workplace discrimination, incarceration rates, arrest, all that kind of stuff. That we don't have to call it race. We can call it racialized identity and have the categories of racialized as Black, racialized as white, and at least have a little way of saying, we're not down with this race thing. But we can have all the same data and all the same conversations. All right. And that's why when I was falling asleep last night, I was thinking to myself, all right, I'm going to do a career change. I'm going to go try and get a job in the Office of Management and Budget in the White House, because they're the ones who decide what goes in the census. Forget all this coaching and adult development stuff. That's the way I can make an impact. And maybe that might be the case. I'm not going to do that. Let's go into Mike's comment. Distinction between colorblind and the approach you're advocating. Okay, so colorblind, someone said, is sort of arises at a certain stage of development. I think it's achiever, where you kind of be like, hey, there's no races, everyone's the same, we're all good. And what's different here is that I see that most of the world racializes folks. And therefore, that has an impact. And personally, I look at someone, I'm like, I can see your skin color, I can see your facial features, I can see your height, I can see your clothing. Maybe once we get into clothing, I make some assumptions, but I don't actually know a lot about what's on the inside of you. In fact, even when I know your Enneagram type, I only know so much because that's only part of who we are. And we, as I said, we identify with our Enneagram types. We are not our Enneagram types. I always say I hang out at 6. I hang out there 60, 80% of the time, you know, not all the time. So same thing. So it's completely different from colorblind, but it's easily mistaken. The other reason it's different is I see people's skin color. Now, when people say colorblind, that's not what they mean. And that's not what Martin Luther King Jr. meant, you know, but yeah, I would actually like to free us up to be able to name physical features without all these connotations. This person has less melanin or more melanin than me. Or even I have a narrower nose. Or this, I have thinner lips. This person has fuller lips. We have such racist connotations with these physical descriptions that mean nothing. They mean nothing about a person. And yet we have all, so we can't even describe people. Now we should be using height and they have glasses. And I mean, there's so many other ways other than black, white that we could be using and do use to some extent. But in my view, you know, the colorblind perspective just doesn't even want to talk about it. I want to talk about it more, which is why I talked too much in my little talk and took too long. So I think we're at the end of our time. Let me just do one quick thing before we let you go. I just want to invite you all to connect. Here's my website, amielhandelsman.com. My friends remind me that I should tell people where to connect with me. If you got my ebook, you're on my list. I send things out a couple times a month. Would love to stay connected with you, and I'm really grateful that you all were really were here and in the conversation. And hope it continues, and it may happen faster in some places than others. And I don't think it's happening that fast in the United States. I don't think it's going that fast here compared to South Africa. But thank you so much for being here, Julia.
Yeah, Amiel, thank you so very much for coming and blowing our minds and challenging us, and allowing us all to try and think through this totally different way of thinking to see where we can have value. And it feels to me like we can't see what to do with it yet, but it's got something in it that's fascinating and useful if we can manage the paradox of race's existence and non-existence.
Can I say one more thing before we go? Because I actually want to give 2 more quick micro habits, particularly for folks identified as white in the United States. I don't know South Africa. Here's 2 micro habits. If you get pulled over by the police, take out your wallet and your phone and put them on the windshield, because that's what people with dark skin have to do. We might as well let the police know we know what the hell's going on. All right. it's also smart, because you never know when someone's trigger happy. So that's one thing. And the second thing is, which we're doing here, is if Black American folks or Black identified give their kids the talk about how to interact with police, we ought to give our kids a talk too, which includes the talk that the other parents are giving. It's just small little micro habits to bring these things into being. So those are a couple more things. So thank you again.
That's good. We know a co-director whose son said to her, "Mom, if you were Black, you would have been arrested for drunk driving, but you were white, so you got through." So we're having the discussion in parts.
Good.
Not safe.
All right,
So,
bye for now, everybody. Yeah.
okay. Well, thank you so very much for coming and for the interesting and riveting discussion. See you soon.
Bye-bye.
Thank you and bye-bye. You know that.
That's it. I can stay a couple minutes if you want to